For men, 4 accounts, 1 life. And for 2,000 years, one accusation has followed the Gospels everywhere they go. They contradict each other. Matthew says 2 angels were at the tomb. John says 1. Mark says the women said nothing to anyone. Luke says they ran and told the disciples immediately. Matthew has Jesus healing a centurion's servant by speaking directly to the centurion. Luke has the centurion sending elders instead, never appearing in person at all. Matthew describes 2 blind men at Jericho. Mark and Luke describe only 1. Which is it? Did the writers get their facts wrong? Did the early church stitch together 4 contradictory legends and staple them into one book and call it scripture? That is the claim you will hear from every skeptic, every debate stage, every late-night comment section. And if you have ever sat with that question and felt a flicker of doubt, stay with me to the end of this video, because you are about to see something almost nobody walks you through carefully. The so-called contradictions in the Gospels are not evidence that the story was fabricated. They are evidence that it was not. In fact, once you understand how real testimony actually works, you will start to see these differences as one of the strongest arguments for the Gospel's authenticity that exists anywhere in ancient literature. Let's walk through it, piece by piece. Here is a question worth sitting with before we go any further. If 4 witnesses to a car accident gave you word-for-word identical statements, what would you assume? You would assume they rehearsed it. Every detective knows this. Every trial lawyer knows this. Anyone who has ever worked a courtroom knows this. When testimonies line up too perfectly, down to the sentence, down to the word, that is the signature of collusion, not honesty. Real eyewitnesses remember different details. They emphasize different moments. One remembers the color of the car. Another remembers the sound. One says it happened fast. Another says it felt like it happened in slow motion. None of them are lying. They are simply human, and no human being experiences an event from every angle at once. The Gospels read exactly like that, and that should not alarm you. It should be one of the things that convinces you they are telling the truth. Keep that courtroom principle in your mind, because we are going to test it against 6 of the most famous contradictions skeptics bring up, one at a time. Matthew 28 verses 2 to 5 describes 1 angel, sitting on the stone, speaking to the women. Mark 16 verse 5 describes a young man in a white robe sitting inside the tomb. Luke 24 verse 4 describes 2 men in shining garments. John 20 verse 12 describes 2 angels sitting where Jesus had lain. At first glance, this looks like a straightforward contradiction. 1 angel or 2. But read carefully, and a pattern emerges. Not one of these 4 accounts says, there was only 1 angel and no more. Matthew and Mark simply focus on the angel who spoke. Luke and John report that there were 2 present. Picture 4 people describing the same press conference. One says, the spokesperson stepped up and answered questions. Another says, there were 2 officials at the podium. Both are true. One writer is highlighting the figure who delivered the message because that is the part that mattered to the story he was telling. The others are giving you the fuller picture of who was actually standing there. If all 4 gospel writers had reported the exact same number of angels in the exact same words, that would be the red flag. Instead, we get 4 honest, partial, human accounts of the same overwhelming morning. And when you place them side by side, they complete each other rather than cancel each other out. Matthew 5 opens with Jesus going up on a mountainside to teach. Luke 6 describes Jesus coming down and standing on a level place. Same Beatitudes, same core message, 2 different locations. So which one happened? This one has a simple answer most people never stop to consider. Jesus was an itinerant rabbi, which means a Jewish religious teacher or scholar who travels from place to place rather than serving a single, fixed congregation. He taught the same core material many times, in many places, to many crowds, the way any traveling teacher repeats his best sermon. It would actually be strange if he preached about the blessedness of the poor in spirit exactly once in an entire 3-year ministry that crisscrossed the region of Galilee dozens of times. The most reasonable explanation, one that many scholars across many centuries have held, is either that Matthew and Luke are recording 2 separate occasions where Jesus delivered similar, in places nearly identical, teaching, or that it is the very same occasion and Jesus came down from a mountainside to a level shelf partway down before addressing the gathered crowd. Luke 6 verse 17 actually supports this reading directly. He came down with them and stood on a level place. Read that verse alongside Matthew's account, and the contradiction disappears entirely. There is a mountain with a level shelf partway down its slope, which is common terrain around the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus stood there to teach the multitude below him while the disciples sat closer, higher up. 2 writers, 2 details, 1 place. This is the one skeptics lean on hardest, because on the surface it looks airtight. Mark 16 verse 8 says the women fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Luke 24 verse 9 says they went and told the 11 disciples and everyone else. Told no one. Told everyone. Pick one. But look closely at Mark's exact wording. Said nothing to anyone is immediately followed by the explanation. For they were afraid. Scholars have long pointed out that this most naturally describes their behavior on the road, in that immediate window of raw terror and shock. They said nothing to anyone they encountered along the way home. Then, once they reached the disciples, the fear gave way to urgency, and they reported everything, which is precisely what Luke describes happening next. Think about how you would actually behave if you discovered an empty grave at dawn. You would not stop to chat with strangers on the road. You would run in silence, mind racing, heart pounding, until you reached the people who needed to know. Silence to strangers on the way, then an explosion of words the moment you reached the ones who matter. Both writers are describing the very same terrified, joyful, disoriented morning from 2 entirely compatible angles. Here is one skeptic's love because it seems almost too clean to explain away. Mark 10 verse 46 and Luke 18 verse 35 each describe Jesus healing one blind man near Jericho, and Mark even names him Bartimaeus. Matthew 20 verse 30, describing what appears to be the same event, says there were 2 blind men. Notice what Matthew does not say. He never says there was only one. He simply reports 2 men where Mark and Luke report one. Likely the more vocal or well-known of the pair. The one whose name had become attached to the story by the time it reached Peter's memory and, through him, Mark's pen. If you tell a friend about a wedding and mention the best man gave a toast, you are not lying if there were actually 2 groomsmen standing beside him. You are simply reporting the detail that mattered to the story you were telling. Matthew, writing his own independent account, adds the second man because he remembered or was told that there were 2. That is not a contradiction. That is precisely what you would expect from 2 writers drawing on separate strands of memory about the same real event. Matthew 8 verse 5 describes a Roman centurion coming to Jesus in person, pleading for his servant's healing. Luke 7 verse 3 describes the centurion sending Jewish elders to plead on his behalf instead, because he considered himself unworthy to approach Jesus directly. This looks like a clean contradiction until you remember how communication and representation worked in the ancient world. Sending a messenger to speak on your behalf was, and still is, understood as speaking through that messenger. A modern parallel makes this instantly obvious. If a company CEO sends a lawyer to negotiate on her behalf, and one newspaper reports the CEO negotiated the deal, while another reports the CEO's lawyer handled the negotiation, both are accurate. Matthew is compressing the account and attributing the centurion's words to the centurion himself, which was standard ancient narrative convention. Luke, the careful historian, preserves the fuller detail of who physically delivered the message. Same event, same outcome, 2 levels of narrative compression. This is the one that trips up even seasoned Bible readers, because it looks like a genuine calendar conflict rather than a simple detail of emphasis. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe the Last Supper as a Passover meal, eaten on the evening the Passover lamb was sacrificed. But John 18 verse 28 says that on the very morning after that meal, the Jewish leaders avoided entering Pilate's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. If they had not yet eaten the Passover, does that mean John is placing the crucifixion a full day earlier than the other 3 Gospels? Here is what resolves it. First century Judea did not run on a single, uniform calendar the way we assume today. Historical and rabbinic sources show that different groups within Judaism, Pharisees and Sadducees among them, calculated the start of Passover slightly differently depending on how they tracked the lunar calendar and when they considered a new day to begin. It is entirely plausible and widely defended by scholars that Jesus and his disciples observed the meal according to one reckoning, while the temple authorities, whom John is describing, were preparing to observe it a day later according to another. Under this reading, both are technically correct. Jesus ate the Passover meal with his disciples on the timeline his group followed. The priests were preparing to eat theirs on the timeline they followed. 2 calendars, 2 convergent gospels, 1 week. There's a second layer to this that is easy to miss and worth sitting with. John is the one gospel writer who deliberately positions Jesus' death to align with the exact hour the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple, John 19 verse 14. That is not John being careless with the timeline. That is John making a theological point on purpose. He wants you to see Jesus dying at the precise moment the sacrificial lambs were dying just up the hill. Because John has already told you, back in chapter 1, exactly who he believes Jesus is. Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. John 1 verse 29. The timing is not a contradiction to explain away. It is the entire argument of his gospel, delivered through the calendar itself. Here is where this gets interesting, and it is the part skeptics almost never engage with honestly. If the Gospels had been fabricated by a group of people sitting in a room deciding together what story to tell the world, the smart move would have been to smooth out every single detail before publishing. Match every number. Match every sequence. Match every quote word for word. A committee inventing a myth does not leave loose threads hanging out in the open, because loose threads are exactly what a hostile examiner pulls on centuries later. The Gospels do not do this. They leave the loose threads in, untouched, uncoordinated, unresolved by the authors themselves, because they are not the product of a committee. They are the product of real, independent memory. Remember what grounds each of these 4 accounts. Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, is building a legal case rooted in fulfilled prophecy, citing the Hebrew scriptures over and over. Mark, drawing on Peter's own eyewitness memory in Rome, is moving at breakneck speed, urgent and unpolished. Luke, a physician, tells you outright in his opening lines that he carefully investigated everything from the beginning by personally interviewing eyewitnesses in Luke 1 verse 3. And John, writing decades later as an old man who had spent a lifetime turning these events over in his mind, is filling in the theological depth the other 3 left implicit. For different men, for different sources, for different audiences, writing at different times, from different places, for different purposes. And when you get 4 accounts like that, accounts that agree completely on the essentials while differing in the details each one chose to highlight, you are not looking at forgery. You are looking at independent testimony converging on the same core event, exactly the way real history is supposed to look. Ancient historians have a name for this specific kind of evidence. They call it an undesigned coincidence. A moment where one gospel casually mentions a detail that another gospel needs in order to fully make sense, without either author appearing to know that the other one supplied it. Here is a striking example. John 6 verse 5 tells us Jesus turned to Philip specifically and asked, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" John never explains why Philip, of all the disciples, was singled out for that question. But flip back to John 1 verse 44, in a completely different chapter, and you learn that Philip was from Bethsaida, the very town nearest the location where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. Philip would have known the local bakers. He would have known the local markets. Neither gospel writer stops to connect those dots for you. You have to notice it yourself generations later. That is not the fingerprint of 2 people copying from the same script. That is the fingerprint of 2 people who were either there themselves or who spoke directly to people who were. Skeptics also point to Matthew 1 and Luke 3, which trace Jesus' lineage back through 2 entirely different lists of names. Matthew traces the royal line through Solomon. Luke traces a different line through Nathan, another son of David. How can one man have 2 different family trees? The explanation held since the earliest generations of the church is that Matthew is tracing the legal line through Joseph, establishing Jesus' rightful claim to David's throne, while Luke is tracing the biological line through Mary, establishing Jesus' actual bloodline descent from David. Ancient Jewish inheritance custom recognized both legal and blood lineage as meaningful, and it was entirely ordinary for a person to be identified through 2 valid lines depending on the specific purpose of the record being kept. Notice something else here too, something that ties this whole video together. Matthew is writing to prove Jesus is the promised king in the legal, prophetic, Abrahamic covenant sense. Of course, his genealogy runs through the royal line of succession. Luke is writing a careful, orderly, physician's account for a wider audience and traces the literal bloodline instead. The contradiction evaporates the instant you remember what each author was actually trying to accomplish, which is exactly what should happen when four honest writers approach the very same truth from four honest, deliberately different angles. There is a category error hiding underneath almost every single one of these skeptical objections, and once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it for the rest of your life. A contradiction is when two statements cannot both be true at the same time. The angel said, "Do not be afraid," and "the angel said nothing at all," would be a genuine contradiction. A compliment is something entirely different. It is when two statements are each fully true but individually incomplete, and only together do they form the fuller picture. "There was one angel who spoke," and "there were two angels present," is not a contradiction. It is two witnesses looking at the very same event and each choosing to report the detail that stood out most to them personally. Nearly every so-called contradiction in the Gospels falls into that second category, not the first. Different emphasis, different selection, different audience, not different facts. And this is where the number 4 stops being a liability and becomes the entire point of the exercise. If God had given the church a single gospel, one polished, seamless account, skeptics could just as easily claim it was too convenient, too clean, too suspiciously perfect to be real testimony. Instead, we were given 4 independent portraits, each with its own texture, its own vocabulary, its own loose threads left untied. And when historians and skeptics alike pull on those threads looking for the seams of a lie, they keep finding the fingerprints of real, lived memory instead. So why does any of this matter beyond a dusty academic debate about ancient texts nobody in your life will ever bring up at dinner? Because the reliability of the Gospels is not just an intellectual curiosity. It is the foundation underneath the single claim that changes absolutely everything. That a man named Jesus lived, taught, died, and rose bodily from the dead. And that this event actually happened in real, verifiable, datable history, witnessed by real people who stake their entire lives on it being true. And here is the detail skeptics rarely want to sit with. Every single one of the apostles who wrote, or who stood directly behind these 4 accounts, eventually faced brutal persecution for maintaining their testimony. People do not lie for a story and then choose to die for it, especially when a single word of recantation would have saved their lives instantly. Tradition holds that Peter, whose memory shapes almost every page of Mark's Gospel, was crucified for refusing to renounce what he had seen. That Matthew faced martyrdom on the mission field far from home. That John was exiled to the barren island of Patmos in his old age for refusing to stop preaching what his own eyes had witnessed decades earlier. Men do not maintain a coordinated conspiracy under torture and execution for a story they invented together in a locked room. They maintain it, unwavering, to their final breath, because they genuinely saw what they said they saw, and no threat on earth could talk them out of it. The small differences scattered across the 4 Gospels are not the crack in the foundation that skeptics claim they are. They are the proof that the foundation is solid rock. 4 honest men, writing honest memories, from 4 honest and independent angles, about the single most important event in the history of the human race. So the next time somebody tells you the Gospels contradict each other, do not get defensive. Just ask them one question back. Would you actually trust 4 witnesses who gave you the exact same story, word for word, with 0 discrepancies at all? Or would you trust 4 witnesses whose accounts overlap completely on every essential fact, while each of them remembers the smaller details just a little differently, the way real people always do? The Gospels were never meant to read like a single, polished press release drafted by a marketing team. They read like testimony, raw and overlapping and human. Because that is exactly what they are. For books, for men, for angles. One risen Christ standing behind every single page.